Hey friends, this is how to use Jira for beginners tutorial where we'll go through everything you need to know so you can use Jira the fast way. We're first going to do a refresher on Agile Concepts and Jira Terms, and then we'll dive into the Jira interface, creating your very first project and setting up Jira issues, user stories, and bugs. And then we're going to set up your project's labels, components, and versions. And finally, how to groom and prioritize items in your backlog and set up your very first sprint. So if you're a complete beginner and you have never used Jira before, then watch this video from beginning to the end. To follow along with this video, I created my free guide with how to use Jira, and it contains all the data that we're going to use to create our project in this Jira tutorial. It's completely for free, and you can download it at alvinthepm.com/free guide. As you watch this free course, join me in the comments down below. What is your biggest struggle with Jira? And what questions do you have about using Jira to manage your Agile projects? So Jira is one of the most popular software tools used to manage Agile projects. But before we can start using Jira, you must understand how Agile works, because Jira assumes that you already know it, specifically with the two popular methodologies of Scrum and Kanban. Now, this is not meant to be a deep dive into Agile, only a quick refresher so you can start using Jira the fast way. If you're already familiar with Agile, feel free to skip this section and go on to the next section to dive into the Jira terms that you must know. So Agile is a methodology that uses an iterative approach to develop a product, building and releasing it incrementally instead of trying to deliver everything to the customer at the very end of a project like you would a traditional waterfall approach. Agile promotes early delivery and focuses on adapting to changing requirements as you obtain customer feedback during every single iteration. Underneath the Agile umbrella are two popular methodologies. We have Scrum and then we have Kanban. These both have different workflows and templates inside of Jira, as I'm showing on the screen right here. Now, for our purposes today, there is one difference, and that has to do with using a time-boxed period of time, what's known as a sprint, to develop the product. The Scrum framework uses sprints, while Kanban does not use sprints. A sprint is an amount of time that the team commits to completing their work and delivering a working product by the end of it. For example, let's say that we define our sprint to be 2 weeks. At the beginning of the sprint, the team holds what's called a sprint planning meeting, where the entire team discusses and agrees upon what work will be completed in the sprint. The team also discusses how much effort it's going to take to complete these items, and they put these items into what's called a sprint backlog, which essentially is a prioritized list of items for the team to work on for the next 2 weeks. And every single day during your sprint, the team holds a daily scrum, or what's known as a quick 15-minute meeting, to review the team's progress and roadblocks on their assigned items in the sprint backlog. And at the very end of the sprint, the team presents the developed product to the product owner or the customer for their review and their feedback. So let's go through a high-level example of a sprint workflow right here. This is a Scrum board inside of Jira, broken up into 4 columns. We have to do, in progress, testing, and done. And in our to-do column, we have 3 tasks that the team needs to complete during the sprint. Code the user interface, fix a bug that's related to the payment screen, and create the database schema. The goal of the sprint is to take all items through each column until they reach the done column. And by the end of the 2 weeks, were we able to complete all the items on our Scrum board? And if not, what roadblocks did we experience during the sprint that prevented us from actually doing that? Now, this Scrum board can look different for every team. And some teams, they may actually want to have more statuses or different columns than what I'm showing on the screen. So in general, this is a very high-level overview with Scrum. Now, some teams prefer to use the Kanban approach because they don't work best within a time box period of time for, let's say, 2 weeks. Now with a Kanban workflow, you'll be using a similar board like the one I'm showing from earlier for Scrum. And your goal is to do everything you can to push all items to done. Now, instead of planning work in a time box iteration, Kanban uses what's called a pull system to move work through the process. Each time the team completes an item of work, it triggers a pull to bring in the next item that they're going to work on. And since there will usually be what's called a work in progress or WIP limit for each column on the Kanban board, whenever there's an empty slot on the board, that's a signal for the team to pull work from the previous columns as long as there are items available. So in general, for Kanban, work is continuously being pulled from the left to the right side of the board. As we move on to the next section for Agile Terms, make sure to smash that like button if you're getting any value out of today's video. So with the Scrum methodology, it breaks down a project into smaller bits of user functionality, which are known as epics and user stories. And these will be the most common types that you're going to create for your projects inside of Jira. An epic is a large body of work that cannot be completed inside of one sprint. And usually your team will break this epic up into multiple user stories. A user story, or what Jira refers to as a story, represents a feature or a capability that needs to be created. It's a brief sentence that describes the desired capability of the product from the perspective of the end user. Hence the name user story, and it's written in the following format. As a user type, I want some capability so that a benefit can be achieved. When all user stories are completed underneath an epic, then the epic itself is completed. For example, if you're building a shopping software app, then the Jira project is the shopping software application. Underneath that, we could have an epic for the shopping cart interface. And one of the user stories within that epic would be, as a customer, I want to check out items from my shopping cart so that I can purchase my items. Now in this example, the role is from the perspective of the customer. The desired capability is to check out items from your shopping cart, and the benefit is to purchase the items. So in Jira, you're going to have multiple user stories linked underneath one epic, as I'm showing in this example on the screen right here. So here, our epic is shopping interface functionality, and I've listed a few examples of user stories that are associated with this epic. Some of these user stories might be completed in one sprint. So in general, this is how the Agile methodology breaks down a project into smaller pieces of work that can be done over iterations. By the way, if you're getting any value out of this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this and to smash that like button. Now let's talk about how Jira works. After you sign up with a free Jira account using my link in the description bar down below, Atlassian will ask you to create a website, which is what will store all of your projects within your organization. Jira operates with the following hierarchical structure. At the very top is your Jira Account instance, which is the website name you created when you initially signed up to Atlassian. Underneath this are the different projects which are associated with the different products, software applications, or services that your team is developing. To set up your projects and everything that's inside of Jira, you create what are known as issues, which are just work items or tickets that require an action from a person. Every ticket that you create in Jira is known as an issue. And Jira has 4 issue categories as follows. Underneath a project are your epics. And as we've discussed earlier, an epic is the largest chunk of work that you can have, and they're used to categorize your work. So think of an epic as the high-level features of your product. For example, user account management, shopping interface module, or product search optimization. Epics, they help us align the product that we're creating to certain features and product goals. Epics typically span several weeks to complete, and they should be a large piece of work. It should not be something that can be done in 1 to 3 days. Now, underneath your epic, Jira has 3 other issue types that you can create. The first is a story, what's also known as a user story, which we reviewed earlier, and they represent new functionality to be built for your product. The second is called a bug, or a defect that was discovered in a previously completed user story that was thought to be quote unquote done. And the next type we have is a task, or work that's required to get an item to be done. And at the lowest level of this hierarchy, you have a subtask. Subtasks are found underneath a story and ideally should be completed in 1 day or less so that the team thinks carefully about what work actually needs to be done. So as an example, when you're logged into your Jira account for your sample project, if you click on the blue create button at the middle top portion of your screen, you're going to see that you can create 4 of these issue types: a task, a story, a bug, or an epic. And we're going to go through this in much more detail later in this video, so make sure to watch this entire tutorial. So now that you understand how Jira is set up, I want you to sign up and create a free account with the Jira software using my link down below. That way you can follow along step by step so we can create an Agile project from beginning to the end. So pause the video and sign up using my link down below. And once you've created your account, return back to this video. So let's hop inside my computer so you can follow along with me. All right, so now that we're inside of Jira, you should see the following interface at the time of this recording. Every year, Atlassian does make some minor improvements and updates to the software, so some things might look different and they may change in the future, but overall, just remember that the overall functionality should not change, at least from the user's standpoint. So to match exactly what I'm seeing, click on the Jira software logo at the top left of your screen, and this should take you to a page designated for your work. Think of the Jira software button at the top left as your homepage screen so you can see quick links to all of your recent projects. Here we can see our newly created recent project called My Scrum Project. And if you move your mouse to the very bottom, you can see that we have 0 open issues. If you click on the drop-down menu for the board, you'll see that we have 1 Scrum board created for this project. Underneath this section are the quick links to the different items that we've worked on. So boards, projects, issues, and any items that have been assigned to me. And lastly, any projects, boards, filters, or dashboards that we've started for quick access. So think of this Start tab kind of like your favorites tab of your internet browser, except it's for Jira. So anytime you click on the star icon next to a filter or a project, it's going to appear in this list. Now, pro tip for me, if you're working on several projects at once, I recommend starring them so they show up right here, and it's going to help speed up tremendously your workflow and productivity. Right now, this won't show anything because we haven't created anything at this point in time. Now, before we create our project in Jira, don't forget to smash that like button to show me your support and so I can keep creating high quality content like this. Now, since we're inside of Jira, I want us to create our very first project for developing an e-commerce shopping software application. As a disclaimer, it's very important that you create your own free Jira account that's separate from the company that you work for so that you'll have your own admin access to create projects and you'll have much more leeway with what you can do, and you'll have a lot more privileges with how you can set things up inside of Jira. So if you're using your company's Jira account, I encourage you to log out and set up your own free Jira account using my link down below. So with that said, a product is any app, product, or service you're developing. For our example, our project will follow the Scrum approach to develop an e-commerce shopping software app. Now let's take a closer look inside. So inside of Jira, to create a project, move your mouse to the Projects tab at the top of your screen and left click it. In the new pop-up menu, click on the button on the very bottom of the menu called Create Project. Atlassian will now ask you to use a specific template to create your project. And on the left-hand side are different templates that we can use, such as software development, service management for IT, work management for tracking tasks, marketing, product management, human resources, and the list just goes on. The templates that you use will be preset and customized how your workflow will appear inside of Jira. So let's go back to the templates for software development. Two of the most common ones are Kanban or Scrum. Kanban, where you can track your work using a simple board and you can limit the work of progress. And if we go back and we choose the Scrum template, then we can plan our upcoming work inside of a backlog, and we can organize our cycles of work into what's known as sprints. So for our project example, let's click on the button for Use Template for using Scrum. Now what we'll see is we have to choose the project type. Is it going to be a team managed project or will it be a company managed project? So the team managed project will only have the essential features. It'll have a much more simplified configuration and it will be more limiting. So to give us the most flexibility with our configuration and so we can set up everything ourselves, let's choose the company managed project. And we'll click on the bottom, the blue button at the very bottom of the screen. Now we're at this screen where we have to input our project details. So for every project that you have to create, you need to set up its project name and its unique key so that it can be easily referenced throughout Jira. For our project name, let's call it e-commerce shopping app. So the project key consists of a few letters that you'll be seeing whenever you're working throughout Jira. It can be anything, but usually you want to name your key a few letters so it's easy to track and remember your issues within your project. For our example, let's name our key ESA. That way it's really easy to remember and see throughout your Jira project. Now let's click on the next button. So far we've added our project name, our project key, we've selected the template for Scrum, and we've chosen the company managed project type. So now let's click on the next button. All right, so now that we've clicked the next button, we have officially created our Scrum project for our software app inside of Jira. Now the first screen that we're seeing right here is for the active sprints, which we'll call as the Scrum board. Jira calls it the ESA board that's named based upon our project key for ESA or our e-commerce shopping app. In the Scrum board, Jira already creates your board with 3 columns from to do, in progress, and done. And when we set up our sprints, we'll see our user stories, tasks, and bugs that we need to complete for the sprint populated within these 3 columns. And the goal here is to get all user stories all the way to the done column. We can transition any item from one status to the next. So for example, from to do and then moving it to in progress and finally to done. And I'll show you later in this video that you can also customize this Scrum board so it shows different columns other than to do, in progress, and done. So at this point in time, we're not seeing any information populated inside of our Scrum board, and that's just because we haven't created any data yet. But not only that, our sprint has not yet started. Now on the left-hand side of the screen is a panel which has different views for your project. Pro tip from me, you can easily collapse or expand this left panel by either pressing this left arrow key right here and then repressing again to expand it, or you can do an alternate keyboard shortcut by pressing the left bracket on your keyboard. So when you press it once, the left panel will disappear and go away. Press the left bracket again and it will reappear. So I like to use this shortcut to maximize my viewing window when I'm reviewing my projects and just make it so much more efficient. Now above active sprints, we have the backlog interface, which is where we'll be adding in and creating all of our issues for our epics, user stories, tasks, and bugs. This entire backlog in this section right here, This is what the product owner or the product manager will be managing and grooming. Now, let's say if your role is as an Agile project manager or a Scrum master or a developer on your Scrum team, then this backlog is how you're going to see work that's coming up in terms of priorities. Now, the backlog screen as well as the active sprints are the two modules that you'll be primarily using whenever you're using Jira. All right, so let's say you're in the Scrum board interface here. Pro tip from me, if you press the number key 1, you will switch directly to the backlog module. And let's say your mouse has not selected anything. If you press the number key for 2, you're going to switch to the active Scrum sprint board as I'm showing on the screen. So just pressing the number key 1 or the number key 2 to switch back and forth between the backlog and the sprint Scrum board. These are super helpful keyboard shortcuts that I use all the time whenever I'm navigating and using Jira. So for our e-commerce shopping software app, the goal is to develop a software that allows customers to search for and buy products from the physical retail store using their phone. So we're going to have 7 epics as part of building this software app. We'll have the shopping cart, canceling orders, user accounts, shopping interface, product search, loyalties program, and shopping location. And underneath these different epics, we're going to have different user stories and some tasks. And separate from this, we're going to also add a few bugs into our Jira project so we can see how bugs and errors in the software can be added into a sprint for tracking and resolution purposes. So you can follow along with this tutorial. You can access all of the sample data that we'll be using inside my free Jira guide. Download it at alvinthepm.com/free guide. All right, so let's create our first epic called shopping cart, and then we'll add our user stories and tasks to it later. To do that, let's navigate to our backlog module by clicking on it or pressing the keyboard shortcut for 1. To create our epic, we have to create an issue for our project. So click on the blue create button that's at the very top portion of your screen, and it's going to open up this dialog box. I like to expand it, that way you can see the full view right here. And what you're going to see is you're going to have to fill out all the different details for this issue. Just remember that all issues must belong inside of a project. So you can see we have our project selected for the e-commerce shopping app. For the issue, we can see that we have 4 available types to us: a task, a story, a bug, or an epic. So let's choose an epic for now. Moving on, the status, let's leave it as to do for now. For the epic name, so it's easy for us to identify it in Jira, let's call it shopping cart. And for the summary name, let's also call it shopping cart. I recommend keeping your summary short and concise because this summary is what you're going to see within your backlog. The next drop-down menu is to define the parent. Since this is the epic itself, there will not be a parent above it. But when we create our user stories and our tasks later on, that's when we'll put this underneath the parent for the epic. So for now, let's leave this as blank. Now we have the components, which we'll cover later in this video. Now for description, this is where we can add some detail about the epic. Let's say that this is for defining the functionality for the shopping cart interface for checking out and purchasing items. All right, so what's great about the description interface is that you can format your text as you want. So you can bold, you can italicize, and you can even color the words for the description inside this text box. It's extremely user-friendly and very easy to use. Underneath that section is the reporter, which in this case is the person who is creating this issue, which in our case is me, so Alvin. There is a drop-down field here for defining its priority. So we have medium, highest, high, low, and lowest. I'm going to leave it for now as medium, and we'll use the priority drop-down more in depth when we create our user stories and tasks. Labels here are a way for us to categorize your issues, so it's easy to filter and search for specific user stories. For now, let's leave this as blank. And then we have linked issues, meaning if your issue is connected to or dependent upon another issue. For assignee, let's leave this as automatic for now, but for future issues, we're going to have to make sure that you assign this to yourself or whoever is going to be assigned to that issue. And lastly, we'll leave sprint blank for now since we haven't yet defined the sprint. And then we can click the blue create button at the very bottom. Now, once we do that, we're going to see a pop-up at the bottom left of the screen saying that we have created ESA 1 issue, which is the epic that we just created. So let's click on this X right here to exit the pop-up. What you'll notice though is that in the backlog screen, the epics do not immediately appear, and that's because they reside within the epics panel. So to open up your epics panel, what you're going to have to do is click on the epic drop-down menu that I'm showing right here. This is at the very top portion of your screen. So click on the epic drop-down menu and click on epic. Now what you're going to see is the epic panel appear towards the left-hand side of your screen. To maximize the viewing space, let's collapse the left side panel for now by either pressing the top left arrow key or by pressing the bracket keyboard shortcut. Pro tip from me, you can easily open up the epics panel by pressing the E keyboard shortcut. So type in E once and it's going to be collapsed. Type E again and then the epics panel will appear again to your left hand side. And it's like this because epics are separate and they're one level above your user stories, your tasks, and your bugs. So right now, we have our shopping cart epic shown on the left panel. Let's add another epic by clicking on the plus sign create epic underneath it. For our second epic, let's create one for canceling orders, and we'll type that into the epic name and summary. All right, so now we've created 2 epics for our project. Let's go ahead and let's create the remaining 5 epics. First is for the user account epic. All right, so for the first epic that we'll create, let's call it user account epic. Let's copy and paste it into the summary. And at the very bottom of the screen, there's a check mark for create another issue. Let's make sure that's actually check marked so that way it speeds up the process for creating our epics and our future issues. Click on create and then you'll see a notification at the very bottom that one issue was created. Let's do another epic for shopping interface. When you do that, make sure that you update the summary and the epic name so they're both updated. So we can see that the epic name and summary has been updated to reflect shopping interface, and then we'll click on create. Again, it'll show that 2 issues have now been created. So let's repeat this again for creating the epic for product search in both the epic name and summary. Let's click on create. And each time you'll see that the number at the bottom also increases as well. So at this point, we have now created 3 issues or 3 epics for our project. Now let's create our next epic for the loyalties program. Let's click create. And then let's type in the next epic for shopping location. We're making sure that we're typing in shopping location both into the epic name and summary. Let's click create, and then we'll see that we've now created 5 epics or 5 issues for our project. Let's click on the X button at the very top. Let's click discard issue. And now we can see that we have populated these issues within our project. So we have shopping cart, canceling orders, user account, shopping interface, product search, loyalties program, and shopping location. Let's take a closer look at one of these. So let's click on the arrow that's next to shopping cart. What you'll see is underneath it, we see the key for the epic. We also see how many issues are associated with this epic. We also see how many have been completed, as well as an estimate of the number of story points that are required to complete this epic. Let's click on view details, and what we're going to have is a separate panel open up on the right hand side. And this will show all of the details that we've entered in so far for this epic. In the top row of icons, we can attach a file to this epic. We can add a child issue underneath this epic, or we can link an issue underneath it, or another website or page, or even Confluence. And right below it, we have the status of this epic. And right now, it's showing that we're in to do. And then we have the description box right below it, which is what we typed in earlier. And right below it are the different details tied to this epic. So we have who the person is assigned to, the reporter or the person who created it. We also have labels and its priority. There are other fields below this as well. So we have story points, original estimate, time tracking, components, sprint, and fixed versions. All issues, whether it's a story, a task, or a bug, will have similar fields as this for an epic, so just something to keep in mind. Pro tip from me, there is a color box icon that's next to the epic name. I encourage you to color code your epics so that it's easier for you to visually identify your epics and group them together. So let's do that right now. Since our epics for shopping cart, canceling orders, shopping interface, and product search are all associated with shopping for product items, let's color code these all a similar bluish or dark teal color. Now they don't all have to be the same bluish color, just as long as they have roughly the same color hue and intensity. All right, so now we've color coded the epics for shopping cart, canceling orders, shopping interface, and product search. And that way it's a little bit easier for us to identify which one is associated with a specific functionality. So now let's color code the epics for user account and loyalties program an orangish color because they're associated with the user admin side of things. So for user account, let's choose the color for orange. All right, so for loyalties program, let's go in, let's view details, and let's change the color of this to also different slightly, maybe like a dark yellow color as well. And lastly, for the epic for shopping location, let's color code it a red color since it's tied to store information. And voila, now we've already color coded all the different epics, so it's a little bit more visually easier to identify and categorize each epic based upon its category. Now, before we start creating our issues within our project, make sure to smash that like button if you're getting any value out of this video, and to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. All right, so let's go ahead and create the user stories for our epics, starting with our first epic for the shopping cart. So going back to our Jira project, to create an issue, you can either click the blue create button at the top of your screen, or you can press the keyboard shortcut button for C, and then this window will appear. So inside this dialog box, you can see that we're underneath the project for e-commerce shopping app. And the issue that we want to create right now is for a story. So let's select that for now. The status, of course, will be to do since we haven't yet started the sprint. And for the summary, I'm going to type in the user story for checking out items in the shopping cart. All right, so we have the summary in there right now. So we have, as a customer, I want to check out the items from my shopping cart so that I can pay for my selected items. For the parent link, this is where we want to choose the epic for the shopping cart. All right, so let's choose the one for shopping cart, ESA-1. And for the description, I like to use this space to define the acceptance criteria that you'll agree upon with your team. So let's copy what I have already pre-written from my guide and let's paste it into here. All right, so that looks good. Let's leave everything else as is, and then let's click the blue create button. We can see right away that our new user story for checking out items from my shopping cart has been added inside of our backlog. So let me explain what each part of this row is inside of the backlog. The first icon at the very left is the box that tells you what kind of issue type it is. So in this case, this icon right here represents the user story. Next, we have our issue key, which is just the project key itself, ESA for e-commerce shopping app, followed by the issue number, so the number 8. And to the right of this, we have the issue summary being displayed in one line. And to the right of the summary, we have the epic type that this falls under, which in this example is for the shopping cart. The next column is for the status of this user story, which is to do. The gray circle towards the very right is the number of story points that your team estimates that it would take to complete this user story. And that's what you typically do during your sprint planning meeting. We haven't filled this information out, so let's leave it as blank. And then we have the priority level of lowest, low, high, and highest. And then to the right of that, we have the person who this issue is assigned to. If you want to, let's say, view the details of this issue, left click the summary of the issue and all the details will appear on the right panel to the right. If you want to open up the issue in a separate window, then left click the issue number that's next to the icon. So left click ESA-8 and it should appear in a separate tab. Now we can see all of the details of this user story in a much larger viewing window. You'll see everything that we entered in for the description, so the acceptance criteria that we typed in, as well as all the details on the right-hand side, as well as activities, so the comments, history of what's happened to this user story, and work log if any specific users track in their work. So for now, let's go back to our backlog. Since we do have several more user stories that we need to create, there is another way to quickly create issues, and that is by clicking on the plus create issue button that is at the backlog section. So making sure that none of the epics are selected, let's click on the plus create issue button. For now, let's add in the next user story for reviewing items in the cart. So now that we've added it in, press enter. So now we've entered that in, and what you'll notice is that you'll have to fill in any of the other details that we typically filled out previously at a later time period, because we do have to assign still the epic and all the other labels as well. So in general, this is a very quick way to create issues, but you will have to go back to each issue and add in the appropriate descriptions and details at a later time. For now, let me input the remaining user stories that are a part of our project, and you can follow along as I do this. So now we've added in all of our user stories. Let's add in a few bugs to the project so we can also visualize how this will look during a sprint. You'll notice that when I click on the plus create issue button here, you can change the issue type to be the bug, which in this case is just a red box with a white circle to indicate that it is a bug. So let's repeat this and I'll copy and paste all the other bug types for this project. So now we've added in all of the user stories and all of the bugs. Now let's say that for our very first user story, for checking out items from the shopping cart, we have several subtasks that we want to keep track of. So let's open this up in a separate tab so we can have a closer look at this. Let's say that we have several subtasks that we want to keep track of. So to add those subtasks to this user story, click on the Create Subtask button, which is right below the user story summary line. Once you do that, this separate line will appear for subtasks. So now let's input several subtasks that we believe are required to complete this user story. I'm going to press enter and it will create the subtask automatically. Let's do this again for the remaining subtasks for this user story. All right, pressing return for the last subtask. and now we're done. And so you can see here that we have a full list of subtasks which are tied directly to this user story. So let's go back to our backlog and let's refresh the page so we can see what it looks like. So when we go back to the backlog, we can see that with this user story selected, we can see all the subtasks that we just inputted on the right-hand panel. Now let's add another group of subtasks for our third user story for updating the number of items inside of our shopping cart. I'm going to open this up in a separate tab. That way it's a little bit easier for us to type in and enter in all of the subtasks. So let's do that right now. All right, so with that completed, we have now inputted all the different subtasks for this third user story. So with that completed, let's go back to our finalized backlog. Let's click the refresh button at the top so it shows all the latest data. Now this is a long list of user stories, and the idea here is to get you familiarized and used to seeing different kinds of issue types within a backlog for your Jira project. Since we created our issues the fast way using the plus create issue row at the very bottom, it doesn't assign the issues to the appropriate epics. So we need to take care of that right now. So to assign a user story to an epic, all you have to do is left click one user story and then drag and drop it to the appropriate epic in the epic panel on the left side. So for the second user story of reviewing items inside your cart, let's select it, left click it, drag and drop into the shopping cart epic. Once you do that, you'll notice that the shopping cart epic has now been attached to this user story. Now, if there's a group of issues that fall under the same epic category, then you can do this very quickly by left clicking the checkmark box to the left of the issue and repeating it for multiple issues and then dragging and dropping them into the appropriate epic label. Let's do that for the first epic for the shopping cart. And voila, all of them automatically update to the shopping cart epic. All right, and so let's do this for the remaining user stories and their corresponding epics. For the canceling orders epic, we have these two, which need to be assigned to the epic for canceling orders. The next group is for the epic for user account, and so it'll start with the user story for logging into my account all the way down to changing my password. So let's drag and drop it into the user account epic. And you can see that the epic categories slowly start to populate across all the different user stories with different labels here. The next category is for the shopping interface. So let's start with the viewing the products available in the store all the way down to viewing which physical store location that you want to see. So let's drag and drop it into the shopping interface epic. Let's unselect those, and then we'll choose the ones for the epic for product search. So starting from the top here, I want to search for items available in the store, and let's go all the way down to showing personalized results of products that I'm interested in. Let's drag and drop this and put this into the product search epic. All right, now all that's remaining is for the loyalties program and shopping location epic. So we have, I want to get discount coupons, I want to receive an anniversary discount, and refer a friend bonus discounts. Let's drag and drop it into the loyalties program right now. All right, and then we have these three remaining user stories, and these are all tied to the shopping location epic. All right, everything is looking pretty good so far. All right, so now we've assigned all of the appropriate issues to their corresponding epics, and you can see their epic category in the right side column here. Pro tip from me, each issue that you create in your backlog should only correspond to one epic. That way, this ensures that the work that your team is performing is aligned with the product vision and what the team is trying to build during the sprint. Now, a really cool feature with Jira is how easy it is to filter and quickly see which items correspond to an epic. So in the left epic panel, when you click on shopping cart, for example, you will only see the issues that are associated with the epic for the shopping cart. If you want to see other issues underneath the other epics, then you have to left click the epic label again. That way it deselects it, and then you can repeat the process so you can quickly see which user stories are assigned to a different epic. So for example, these are all the user stories tied to shopping interface. For loyalties program, here are all the different user stories that are assigned to it. And of course, here are the ones for product search. So again, it's very helpful and it's very easy to quickly identify which user stories are tied to the appropriate epic. So by this point, we have populated our entire backlog, or what's known as our product backlog, that will be used to develop our e-commerce shopping software app. We have created several epics that are linked to different user stories, tasks, and bugs, and we have color-coded each epic so that they're easier to identify and filter. Now let's take a look at how you can categorize your issues using what's called labels so it's easier for you to identify and search for them in your project. And later on, you'll be able to filter out your issues based on these labels. Now think of a label as a one-word piece of text to categorize similar user stories, tasks, or bugs. Jira doesn't currently let you type two separate words as a label, so if you do have to use two separate words, then use an underscore or a dash between the two words. So for our e-commerce shopping software application, we'll label all user stories that are under our epics as follows. For the epics for shopping cart, canceling orders, shopping interface, and product search, we'll use the label that's called shopping. Now everything that's tied to the management of the user administration and the account handling side of things, we'll label these issues as a user admin. So that will be for all the issues that are underneath the two epics for user account and loyalties program. And lastly, for any user story that's tied to displaying store information, we'll label it as store info. So let's hop back into Jira and I'll show you how to label these issues. All right, so now we're back into the backlog interface. When you click on a user story, for example, this one, the right panel will appear. When we scroll down to the details area, you'll see a separate section called labels. This is where you can type in your one-word text to categorize your issue. For this specific issue, since it's underneath the parent epic for shopping cart, let's call this label for shopping. And then we'll select this so it's a new label. So now that it's applied, let's click return. So now we can see that the shopping label has been applied to this specific user story. Let's click on the second user story in the backlog and let's go down to the label section right here. When you click on the drop-down menu, you'll see our newly created label for shopping appear right here. So let's click it and then click outside of that area to finalize our choice. So pro tip from me, to quickly label an issue, after you select it, all you have to do is press the keyboard button for L and it will take you directly to the label dropdown and you'll be able to select the label for your issue. So now with that said, let's go ahead and let's label all the other issues underneath the epics for canceling orders, shopping interface, and product search as shopping. And as you go through this, you'll start to see how easy it becomes once you start using the keyboard L shortcut button to quickly label your user stories. So now we're going to repeat the labeling for shopping interface. I'll use my keyboard shortcuts, that way we can go through this very quickly. And rinse and repeating that for the epic for product search. Now let's label all issues underneath the epics for user account and loyalties with the label of user admin. You'll notice that I'm typing in the label with the hyphen in between them or a dash because you generally want to only use one word to characterize your label. So I'll type in user-admin. And we'll repeat this for the remaining user stories that are underneath the epic for user account. And you'll find that it's really straightforward and easy to add in the labels once you've already set them up into your system. Let's do this again for the ones for the loyalties program. And lastly, let's label all of the issues underneath the epic for shopping location with the label as store info. All right, so now we've labeled all of our user stories with the correct label. With Jira, we can quickly filter which issue is tied to the appropriate label by using this label filter that's at the top. So an example, here are all of the different issues that are associated with the label for shopping. So everything that's tied to the epic for shopping cart, canceling orders, shopping interface, and product search. If we go back, we can select only the issues tied to store info, which is for shopping location. And then for user administration, we have all the user stories tied to user account and the loyalties program. By the way, as we move on to the next section, make sure to smash that like button if you're gaining any value out of this video. All right, so now we have our complete list of backlog items with user stories, tasks, and bugs tied to the appropriate labels and epics. Now, Jira has two more tools that allow us to prioritize and sort through all of our issues, and they are what's called components and versions. Let's first talk about components. If you open up the left side panel, you'll see a separate module for components. If you click it, you'll see here that it's completely empty. Atlassian will tell you about the Compass component section, but they also have one that's specific to Jira components. And you can see here that it's completely empty because we haven't created any components at this point in time. As Jira says it right here, components are subsections of a project, and you want to use them to group issues within a project into smaller parts. Components are very similar to labels, but to create them, you do likely need to be an admin. But since you created your project with your own Jira account, you should have the ability to create components for your project. As an example of how you would use components, let's say that you're developing a software application. You could have two separate components for the different platforms the app would operate in. For example, iOS versus Android or Windows versus Mac OS. And based on the component type would mean that the issue will be assigned to the appropriate engineer to work on. So similar to labels, you can use filters based on the components and see the issues which are tied to that component. So let's go ahead and create two components for our project. First, click on the Create Component button, and you should see this dialog box pop up. For our first component, let's call it iOS. For description, let's type in compatibility for iOS devices. For component lead, let's assign this to yourself. So in my case, I'll type in Alvin. And then for default assignee, let's select component lead, and that way it'll assign it to yourself. Click Save, and we'll now see that we've created our first component. I'm going to ignore this pop-up for Compass, and instead we're going to focus only on the things tied to Jira components for now. We have our first component, so we have the component name, component description, who the component lead is, the default assignee, which in this case is the component lead, for any issues that are associated with this component, and then we have the number of issues tied to this component. Let's create our second component for Android by clicking on the Create Blue button on the top right side of your screen. Let's call the second component Android. And for description, let's type in compatibility for Android devices. Let's leave the other fields blank for now, and let's click on Save. Let me show you how components can be assigned to issues. So let's go back to our backlog interface so we can see all the different issues inside of our backlog. Let's click on the first user story right here so it pops it open, the details on the right hand side. Let's click on the issue number so it pops open in its own separate tab. On the right hand side of the screen, underneath the details area where there it says more fields, there should be a separate section called components. If you left click this box, you're going to see a drop down menu and you can choose the appropriate component that is tied to this user story. So for example of purposes, let's assign this user story to the iOS component. When we click out of it, we'll see that this iOS component has been assigned to this user story. So when you assign components to your other issues, you'll be creating a hierarchical structure for your project. That way, it's easier to identify which user stories and tasks are tied to iOS development or Android software development, for example. All right, so let's go back to our component interface. So when we click on components, we'll be taken to this screen. When we click on the number of issues that are tied to the iOS component right here, what we'll see is a different search area that's showing all of the different issues that are tied to the component for iOS. In our case, it will only show us the one issue that we just assigned to it. So this is very helpful if you have a lot of user stories tied to the development of different software platforms that you need to manage and sort through. And for now, let's go back to our main project and let's talk about how we can use versions to track the releases of specific features of our software app project. On the left-hand side of the panel, there is a releases interface module here. So click it and you should now see this screen. As Jira says it right here, versions help you package and schedule project deliveries as a release of your work. For software projects, your releases will usually be something like release 1.0, 1.1, 2.0, and so on. So let's create a version by clicking on the Create Version button. For our first version of the software that we're developing, let's call it version 1. For our start date, let's say that we're starting on January 15, 2024, and that our planned release date is about 6 months from now by end of Q2 2024. So that would be, let's say, June 28th of this year. For description, let's say that the purpose of this initial release is to allow customers to buy products online. Let's click Save, and we'll see right away that we now have our version 1 populated in this table. The status, of course, is still unreleased. No issues have been linked to version 1 yet, and so the progress is no issues. And to the right of these columns, we see our planned start date and our planned release date for releasing this software version to our customers. And finally, we see the overall description of the purpose of this software version. Now let's go back to our backlog interface so we can see how versions can be linked to our issues, whether it's a user story, a task, or a bug. On the top bar menu right here, you'll see a drop-down menu for versions. Click on it and then select version. Similar to how our epics panel is, versions also have a separate panel. That way it's easier to access and see which issues are linked to the appropriate software release. Pro tip from me, if you press the keyboard button for V, it will expand or collapse the left panel for versions. That way it's much easier to access. So let's close out the epics panel and let's focus only on versions for now. Now if you click on the arrow next to version 1.0, you'll see all the details that are tied to this software release. We see its general description that we just defined earlier, as well as the number of issues that have been assigned to it and those that have been completed. We also see the planned start and planned release date for this version. Now to link our issues to version 1.0, all you have to do is drag and drop our user stories on top of it. So let's drag and drop our first user story onto version 1. And you'll see that the user story has now been labeled as version 1. So let's go ahead and let's add all of the issues under the epic for shopping cart, canceling orders, and shopping interface to version 1. Pro tip from me, you can quickly select multiple issues and drag and drop them onto the version so it classifies them much faster. Let's rinse and repeat that for the epic for canceling orders, and let's tie that to version 1. Let's also tie the version 1 to the epic for shopping interface. All right, so now we've added in these version 1 releases to the epics for shopping cart, canceling order, and shopping interface. Now let's say that we want the issues underneath the epics for user account and product search to be underneath the next software release for version 2.0. So to create the next version, click on the plus create version button in the left panel. Let's call our version 2.0. And let's put in here for the planned start date, let's say that it's going to be July 8th. And then for the planned release date, let's say that it's going to be September 30. Let's leave the driver to be me still. And for description, let's say that this is the beta release for user accounts and product searches. And then we'll click on save. All right, so now let's go in and drag and drop the user stories underneath the epics of user accounts and product search into the second version. To make this fast, let's left click the checkmark box for each of these ones under the epic for user account, and let's drag and drop this underneath version 2.0. And then we'll see version 2.0 labeled and categorized for these user stories. And then let's rinse and repeat this for the epic for product search. All right, so now we've labeled those two epics with version 2.0, and all that's remaining is now the next version for version 3.0. All right, so now let's create version 3.0, which will store the remaining user stories and bugs. Let's call it version 3. And let's have it have a start date at the beginning of October with a planned release date by the end of December of 2024. And for description, let's call it Added Loyalties Program and Shopping Location Interface. Let's now go ahead and assign the remaining issues to version 3.0. And then for the other bugs that we have here, let's add that into the software version for 1.0. Now we've assigned all user stories to the appropriate software version release. So when you click version 1, for example, you'll only see the issues that are applicable for that software release. So this feature of Jira and being able to filter based upon the version release itself is extremely helpful to prioritize and see which work items will be prioritized on its upcoming software release for its general product roadmap. And you can see the general overview of all the releases when you click on the releases interface right here. So when you expand it out, you can see everything that we created previously. So version 3, version 2.0, and version 1. If let's say that all of the user stories underneath release version 1 is ready for release, then all you have to do is go all the way to the right-hand side, click on the 3 dots icon, and then select release. Now for the purposes of this video, we won't be releasing anything at this point in time, so we can move on and talk about managing our backlog and doing what's called backlog grooming. All right, so one of the most important aspects of leading Agile projects is prioritizing your team's work based on which features bring the most value to the customers. In other words, what features must they have so the product can be used? And with Agile, it's very important to prioritize and rank your issues against each other so it's clear what work needs to happen in the upcoming sprint. And typically, the one responsible for doing this will be the product owner, the product manager, And in some instances, depending on the company and how your role's expectations are set up, the Agile Project Manager or Scrum Master, those two may help out as well and facilitate those discussions. So going back to Jira here, you put your full list of work inside of this entire backlog, and Jira allows us to drag and drop each issue, whether it's a user story or a bug, into the appropriate order. And in doing that, we're changing the priority of each issue. So for example, if I drag and drop the third user story above the second one, then that means that it has a higher priority than the one we pushed right below it. This is a very simple concept to understand, but it's actually harder to understand and implement in real life, especially if you have a long list of more than 20 to 50 items that you need to rank and prioritize all at once. And it can feel extremely overwhelming. So let me share with you my own tips with how you can prioritize and groom your product backlog. All right, now since we've already classified our work based on the software versions that we'll be releasing, let's toggle the versions panel by pressing the keyboard button for V. That way it expands. And we will only select version 1 for now. That way we only focus on the items of work that need to be released as soon as possible for the first initial software release. And as you can see, the number of issues that we have to prioritize has gone down by more than half, which makes it less overwhelming for us. So instead of originally 44 issues, we now just have to prioritize 16 issues. Since versions 2 and version 3 won't be released anytime soon, we can focus our efforts only on versions 1, features which must be released in the next few months. So let's take a look and let's go through all the items in our backlog for version 1.0. The first user story is for checking out items from the shopping cart. Since it's very important for customers to be able to place items for purchasing, let's leave this as the number one priority for now. Let's go down to the second user story, and we see here that this one is to review the items in the shopping cart. Let's keep this as a lower priority than the first one. I want you to note here that as we're going through the backlog, you'll see that I only prioritize issues going upward and not downward, meaning I focus on sending items up the top portion of the backlog and not downward. I like to review each issue line by line and compare it to the ones above it. If the issue is not that important, then I do not send it to the bottom of the backlog. I like to leave it as is, and I go on to the next issue until I find one that has a higher priority. And from my own experience, this makes grooming the backlog a much more easier and simplified process, so you only have to go through the backlog one time instead of having to repeat and go through it multiple times. The third user story for updating the number of items in the shopping cart does not have a higher priority, so let's leave it as is and let's go to the next one. Now we can see here that the next two user stories are about customizing the customer's shipping address. For our example, let's say that these two user stories are higher priority than being able to update the items in the shopping cart. So let's left click the checkmark box to the side of these issues and let's drag and drop them above the user story for updating the number of items in the shopping cart. When we let go, it automatically ranks it higher than the story for updating the items in the shopping cart. Let's now move on to the next issue, which is the user story for adding in credit card information. Since this involves allowing a customer to pay for their purchase, let's say that this user story has a higher priority than the one above it. So let's left click it and drag and drop it above that line item. Now the next user stories are tied to canceling orders, which do not have a higher priority than the ones for the user stories underneath the epic for shopping cart. So let's leave these as is for now. The next user story is for viewing products available in the store, and this has a higher priority than the user stories for canceling orders. So let's drag these above these two in terms of ranking and priority. Now we have the next user story, which is for choosing the size and quantities for the items that the customer wants. Now this user story has a higher priority than the user story for updating the items in the cart. So let's drag and drop it above these ones. This user story also has a higher priority than adding in the credit card information or customizing the shipping address. So let's drag and drop it above those in terms of priority. All right, now going back to this user story, which is I want to view products available in the store. This one, well, customers must be able to view products that are available in the store before they can actually make a purchase. So this story would technically have a number one priority. So let's drag and drop it above the first user story for checking out items in the shopping cart. All right, now we have the next two user stories for viewing the sales price of similar items in the catalog. This one seems like it would have a higher priority because it's tied to viewing the products in the store so that they can make a purchase. So let's make this a higher priority than being able to customize your shipping address and possibly even reviewing the items in the cart. So let's make it a number 3 priority in terms of the backlog. So now the top 3 items in the backlog are viewing products available in the store. I want to check out items from my shopping cart and viewing sales price of similar items in the catalog for purchase. Now for the remaining issues that are inside our backlog, these have not yet been prioritized. For the first bug, this is an error when the user tries to check out with the shopping cart. Since this is tied to being able to check out items from my shopping cart, let's drag and drop this below the priority of the checking out items user story in terms of priority. That way it at least gets prioritized in the top 3. For the next one, we have search results do not appear when using the Android mobile app. For this one, since this is more tied to searching, let's leave it as is. And actually, let's drag and drop this so that way we can move it to a higher priority so it's right below the first error message. And for the other bug, for Windows do not resize when the app begins loading, since this is a lower severe bug and defect, let's leave it as is. And for the final bug where the incorrect amount of bills and expenses adds up during checkout, this seems like a very critical issue that does need to be resolved. So let's drag and drop it to a higher priority right below being able to ensure that search results do appear. So now we have reprioritized all of the items in our backlog. The first 5 are viewing products available in the store, checking out items from the shopping cart, fixing the different bugs tied to checking out the cart, fixing search results, and fixing the correct amounts of bills and expenses when you're checking out items that are more than 5 quantities. So now we've groomed the entire backlog for all of the features that must be developed for the first release of our software. Again, this is just an example to show you how to groom your backlog and how to prioritize and rank each user story using Jira. Now, before we can set up our sprints, we need to make sure that everything inside our backlog is set up correctly. First is every issue assigned to an epic. So to do that, pull up your backlog and let's open up the epic panel. Left click and choose the option for issues without epics. For any issues which do not have an assigned epic, we want to assign them appropriately. Epics are very important because they make sure that all of our user stories and tasks, especially bugs, are aligned to the features and the goals of the product that we're developing. So in this case, we forgot to assign these bugs to the correct epics. So let's go through this line by line. Error message when user tries to check out with shopping cart. This is tied to shopping cart, so let's drag and drop it right here. The second one is tied to search results, so let's tie it to product search. The next bug is tied to shopping cart for incorrect amounts. So again, that's tied to shopping cart. And then this one is more of Windows does not resize when the app begins loading. This one is more of a shopping interface, so let's drag and drop it here. All right, so everything looks good, and we have now assigned all of the issues to the appropriate epics, as we can see on the screen right here. Now, the next thing to do is to make sure that our backlog items are assigned with the correct version. So let's pull up the version panel by pressing the V keyboard shortcut or by left clicking on the version menu right here. Now let's click on the button for issues without versions, and we can see that we have a handful of issues that are not tied to a specific software release. It's important to assign these correctly so it's clear when we plan to release certain features. So let's go ahead and assign all these issues to version 1. To do that, we'll bulk select all of these issues by pressing the Shift button, and then we'll drag and drop them onto version 1. All right, so now that we've done that, this will automatically correct itself, and there are no issues that have been labeled without the correct version. So if we click on version 1, everything is correctly labeled as version 1, as we can see right here. And if you deselect version 1, as you scroll through it, all issues and user stories have been labeled with the correct version. And version 1 consists of all the user stories, tasks, and bugs that need to be worked on as soon as possible for our very first software release. All the other versions are a much lower priority since these will not be released until later on in the year. All right, so now that we've groomed our entire backlog and we prioritized the issues for our first release, let's set up the very first sprint for our project. Now, before we do that, don't forget to smash that like button so I know you like and appreciate my content. Now, Jira already pre-creates your sprint for you when you initially set up your project, but let's say that you don't have your sprint already created. So let me show you how to create your sprint. So I've deleted it already, and to create your sprint, all you have to do is click on the button that says Create Sprint. And when you do that, you'll see a new drop-down section appear for the first sprint, which is called ESA Sprint 1. And in the middle area right here is where we can drag and drop the different user stories that we want our team to work on for the current sprint. And so when you're using the Scrum framework as a Scrum Master or Agile Project Manager during your sprint planning meeting, you're going to work with a product owner and your team to identify which issues are the ones that your team can realistically complete based on the required effort using an estimate that's known as story points. Now, when we look at the issues inside the backlog, you'll notice that there are these gray circles with a line through them. This is where you assign story points to each user story. In other words, what is the amount of effort that your team thinks is required to complete it? And to assign user stories, it's typical for teams to pull numbers from a modified version of the Fibonacci sequence from the following: 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13. And I'll show a matrix table on the screen right here. That way you can have it for your reference. So it's clear what story point corresponds to the amount of effort, time, and task complexity. For our example, let's go through the first several user stories and assign story points to them. Again, in real life projects, you want to work with your team to provide you with these story point estimates. For our first user story of viewing products in the store, let's say that this will take a moderate amount of effort and likely a few days of time. So let's assign it a user story point value of 5. And then we'll click the checkmark box that appears. And voila, we're doing this based on the matrix table that I'm showing on the screen right here. For our second user story of checking out items from the shopping cart, let's say that this requires a severe amount of effort and it will take roughly at least a week due to the medium complexity of work involved. So let's assign a story point value of an 8. So for today's purpose of this tutorial, we're only going to be assigning story points to the user stories. So we're going to skip over the bugs for now. The next user story is for viewing the sales price of similar items in the catalog. So as you can see, as we've started assigning story points to each user story, we can see that this number has already started pre-populating and summing up the number of story points that our user stories have been assigned to. So in this case, we have a total story point number of 13. Let's skip over our bugs for now and let's move on to our next two user stories. For these two, let's assign both of them story point values of 5. And for our fifth user story, let's assign it a value of 8 story points. And for our sixth user story, let's assign it a value of 3 story points. And right away, we can see that we've already estimated a total of 34 story points. Now, let's say that your team agrees that this amount of work that we've already calculated here is the total amount of work that the team can commit to completing for the current upcoming sprint in the next 2 weeks. So to assign these issues to the current sprint, all you have to do is left click the checkmark box to the left of the user stories and pressing shift all the way down to the last user story. So now we've selected the user stories plus the bugs. And then let's drag and drop them into the current sprint. And voila, we have all user stories and bugs with a total of 34 story points assigned to the current sprint number 1. Again, these user stories have not yet been assigned to a team member since this is just a sample project for playing with so you can get familiar with how to use Jira. Let's assign all of these different user stories and bugs to yourself, which in this example would be my name, aka Alvin. And in real life projects, you would actually assign different user stories to multiple people so that each person is not overloaded beyond their work capacity. So on the right hand side with the person icon, you'll do what I just did and you'll assign it to the appropriate person. So now all user stories for the upcoming sprint number 1 have been assigned to the correct person and they've kept their prioritization from when we prioritized and groomed the backlog. So to start the sprint, all you have to do is click on the blue button that says Start Sprint, and then we'll see this window pop up. For the sprint name, let's leave the sprint name as ESA Sprint 1. And for duration, in real life projects, I like to usually set this to be 2 weeks, but for the purposes of this video tutorial, let's do a custom duration. For start date, I'll put today's date, which is January 1, New Year, right? And then for the end date, we're going to put January 1 as well. And so that I can show you everything for using sprints, I'm going to have this finished in the next 45 minutes. So that should be roughly by 4:30 p.m. That way I can walk you through what the sprint will look like when it's completed, and I can demonstrate how it works. For the sprint goal, let's say that the goal is to create the checking out functionality in the software app. Now let's click the blue button for start. And when we do that, Jira automatically takes us to the sprint Kanban board and has already populated it with all the user stories assigned to the to-do column. So all the user stories, as well as the different tasks that are tied to this user story. And if I collapse it, you can see everything that has already been created inside of here. We see here also that the subtasks for the first user story are shown below it, with the remaining user stories occupying their own visual card. Now, if we click a card for the first user story or the subtask, it'll pop open on the right-hand side so we can see all of the details. Unfortunately, this is a simple board with only 3 columns for to do, in progress, and done. And in real life projects, you might need to customize it to suit the needs of your team and the best practices for your organization's approach. So to keep this video tutorial a little bit more simplified, we're going to be focusing only on the user stories and subtasks that we've put inside of our sprint. So to customize our Scrum board to suit the needs of your team, or let's say your organization, all you need to do is click on the 3 dots button right here at the top right corner and then select Configure Board. After you wait for a little bit, it's going to pop open the settings for the ESA board. Now we want to go to the settings for columns. We can see here the 3 different columns that Jira has already created for us. For our workflow, we have to do, in progress, and done. For our workflow, let's create another column called to verify. So let's click on the plus symbol right here, and let's call this new column to verify. We'll leave category as is for now, and we'll click on add column. So now we have our updated status and updated columns. So we have to do, in progress, to verify, and done. So if we go back to our project, to our Scrum board, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see the updated columns that we just implemented with to verify right between in progress and done. Now during your sprint, when you're reviewing your team's progress on their completed task and user stories, all you have to do is drag and drop the subtask or the user story into the appropriate column. So as an example, let's drag and drop this subtask called Write Acceptance Test and Review into the column for in progress. And you'll see that it now has moved, and the number here for in progress has now changed to 3. And then of course the goal is to move all items from to do all the way to done. So let's go ahead and move these 3 subtasks all the way to done so you can see what that looks like. And you can see that once it hits done, a green box appears right around it to showcase that it's been completed. And the key ID number for that issue has been crossed out, showing that it has been completed. Now let's say that we finished all subtasks for the first user story. So let's drag and drop all of them across the different columns of this Scrum board, and then we'll do our best to put them underneath the done column. And when you do that, you're going to see that this new window appears. All subtasks for a parent issue are now complete. Do you want to update this parent issue to match? So let's click on done, and let's click update to reflect that accordingly. To have your board reflect that this user story has now been completed, click the refresh button for your window and it should change to reflect done. So now this user story has been marked completed. Collapsing this user story, we now have the other user stories that we do need to complete for this sprint. So let's go ahead and let's drag and drop a few of the other user stories into the next 2 columns to showcase their progress for our team's work. And we'll put a few on to verify and a few in progress. And voila, we've completed 2 user stories in done. We have 1 in the status of to verify, 1 in progress, and 1 that's still to do. As we're doing this, you'll also notice that the number of issues that's shown next to each status column also changes to reflect this progress. Pro tip, usually in real life projects, as you update each user story, you want to input a comment into each user story as I'm showing on the screen. All right, so in this comment, I put in work has started and coding has developed. Of course, this comment will be dependent upon what your team member actually does. They may even go in themselves to input the update, but at least this shows you the idea that you can input comments to reflect the latest progress on different subtasks and user stories. By the way, in the top right portion of the sprint, you'll see a clock showing how much time is left before your sprint is over. This is just a neat feature that Jira has, so you'll have it in mind as you're reviewing your team's work. Now that we've gone through the different user stories for this sprint and we've pushed them from to do to done, let's close out this sprint by clicking on the Complete Sprint blue button. We'll now see this new dialog window pop open. We have the opportunity to select where we want our unresolved open issues to be moved into, whether it's a new sprint or to the backlog. It's also kind of cool because it tells us how many issues have been completed and how many issues are still open. In our case, we have 2 open unresolved issues. As best practice, I like to have my unfinished user stories moved back to the backlog so that they can be reevaluated by the product owner and the team for what the priorities should be. So let's select the backlog for now and then click Complete Sprint. All right, so now Jira has updated it, and right now we've been taken outside of our Kanban board view and we're back into our backlog. In the versions panel to the right, we now see a progress bar of how many user stories have been marked done and how many are still in progress. So 4 out of 16 are done and 1 out of 16 are in progress. And at the end of every sprint, you'll also gain access to different reports. To do that, click on the reports menu on the left side panel. You can review different kinds of reports such as the burn up, the burn down chart, as well as the sprint chart. So let me show you real quickly what that looks like. So this is the burn down chart. Again, this will not be what it would actually look like since we did finish it very quickly. This would then be the burn up chart. And then this is then the sprint report. So for the scope of this video tutorial, let's go through the sprint report. Here we have an overview of our burn down chart. And at the bottom, we have a status report of how many issues our team completed and the issues which were not completed. For our burn down chart, this is just an example of what you might see. As a disclaimer, the chart that I'm showing you right now would not be representative of what you would actually see for your real life projects, since we did try to finish everything in less than 30 minutes. As a disclaimer, this is just a demonstration so you could see what it's like to move different user stories and items from the different columns all the way to done. And at the bottom, this is your status report where you can review your data with your team and discuss what happened and what was the roadblock that prevented us from completing these remaining user stories. And in so doing, you're planning ahead for how your team can perform better for the next upcoming sprint. In other words, what can we do in the next sprint to prevent this from happening? Now, if you have too many issues that are showing not completed, then it's likely that your team was too optimistic and they overestimated how much effort it would take to actually complete the work. All right, so if you stuck with me this far, you have now mastered how to use Jira for beginners. And I want to personally congratulate you. You have learned a lot over the past hour, and I want to encourage you to go back, rewind, and watch any areas of the Jira tutorial that you're struggling with. And if you haven't done so already, download my free Jira guide so you can follow along at alvinthepm.com/free guide and fast track your path to learning how to use Jira. If you're struggling figuring out if project management is the right career path for you, then watch this video next, and I'll see you in the next video.